There are things that happen in this world that science struggles to explain. Events so strange and so deeply unsettling that they seem to belong to fiction rather than reality. People killed by objects falling from a clear sky. Hundreds of skeletons scattered around a frozen lake, their skulls cracked open by something that came from above. Glowing orbs of fire drifting through churches and homes, killing without warning. An invisible sound that no instrument could detect, yet it drove people to the brink of madness. Tonight, we walk through 7 of these stories, each one real, each one documented, and each one involving something that, by all logic, should not exist. It was a cool, clear morning on March 3, 1876, in the rolling countryside of Bath County, Kentucky, about 50 miles east of Lexington. The sky was pale blue, not a cloud to be found, and a light breeze drifted in from the west. There was nothing about this day that suggested anything unusual was about to happen. Rebecca Crouch, a farmer's wife, was outside in her yard, tending to a cast iron vat of water she was heating to make soap. Her grandson, a boy named Alan, who was about 12 years old, was playing nearby. Her husband and her adult son had left earlier that morning for a trip to the nearby town of Frenchburg, so it was just Rebecca and the boy out there, going about their morning routine in the quiet countryside. Sometime just before noon, Alan suddenly stopped what he was doing and looked up. He called out to his grandmother that it was starting to snow. Rebecca looked up too, and that's when she felt it. Something was falling from the sky. Small, wet, reddish pieces of something she couldn't immediately identify were drifting down through the air and landing on the ground around her, on the fences, on the grass, and on her clothing. One larger piece struck the ground just behind her with what she later described as a snapping sound. But this wasn't snow. These pieces were soft, fleshy, and warm. They were red. Some were the size of large snowflakes, but others were considerably bigger. One piece was measured at roughly 4 inches square. Meat was falling from the sky. The event lasted only a few minutes, maybe less, but it covered an area roughly 100 yards long and 50 yards wide, about the size of a football field. When it stopped, the ground around the Crouch farm was littered with chunks of what appeared to be raw flesh. It stuck to fences, it clung to the grass, and it smelled unmistakably of animal matter. The next day, word began to spread through Bath County. Harrison Gill, a local man whose credibility was considered unquestionable by his neighbors, traveled to the Crouch farm to see for himself. He confirmed the scene, noting the meat sticking to fences and scattered across the ground, and described the flesh as appearing to have been perfectly fresh when it fell. 2 other men, whose names were never recorded, arrived and did something that even by the standards of the 1870s seems remarkably bold. They tasted it. Both men declared that the substance was either venison or mutton. Within days, the story was picked up by newspapers across the country. The New York Times ran it. Scientific American weighed in. People called it the Kentucky Meat Shower, or, with a bit more literary flair, the Kentucky Shower of Flesh. Everyone had a theory, but nobody had an answer. Samples of the meat were collected and preserved, mostly in glycerin, and sent to chemists and microscopists in Kentucky, Ohio, and New York for analysis. The first scientist to offer a conclusion was a man named Leopold Brandeis, who declared that the substance was not meat at all, but nostoc, a type of cyanobacterium that forms gelatinous colonies and swells dramatically when it comes into contact with moisture. Scientific American ran his findings with confidence, calling it a proper explanation at last. But there was a glaring problem with this theory. Nostoc swells when it rains. And on the morning of the meat shower, there was no rain. The sky was perfectly clear. That explanation was quickly challenged by other researchers. Dr. Alan McLean Hamilton and Dr. J.W.S. Arnold, both histologists, examined 7 preserved samples under microscopes and came to a very different conclusion. They identified structures consistent with mammalian tissue. 2 of the samples appeared to be lung tissue, 3 were muscular tissue, and 2 were cartilage. These were findings published in the medical record and later discussed in the American Journal of Microscopy and Popular Science. Whatever had fallen from the sky over the Crouch Farm was animal in origin. Of that much, the scientific community became increasingly certain. But what kind of animal, and how had its flesh ended up scattered across 100 yards of Kentucky farmland from a cloudless sky? The most widely accepted explanation then, and arguably still now, came from Dr. L.D. Kastenbein, a professor of chemistry at the Louisville College of Pharmacy. He obtained his own sample, set fire to it, and noted a distinctly rancid mutton smell. His theory was simple and deeply unpleasant. He proposed that a large flock of vultures, flying at great altitude, had simultaneously regurgitated their most recent meal. Vultures are known to vomit defensively when startled, and when one does it, others in the group tend to follow. From high enough in the air, the wind would have scattered the expelled material over a wide area, giving it the appearance of falling from nowhere. This theory gained further support from locals, who pointed out that both turkey vultures and black vultures were common in the area and were known to feed on carcasses of sheep, deer, and livestock. If an entire flock had gorged on a dead animal and then taken flight, the chain reaction of vomiting could conceivably produce the volume of flesh witnessed on the ground. It was disgusting, but it was also the closest anyone could come to a plausible explanation. To this day, however, the Kentucky meat shower has never been definitively solved. A sample of the original flesh still sits in a jar at the Monroe Musnick Medical and Science Museum at Transylvania University in Lexington. The meat has been analyzed repeatedly over the decades, but it's been so contaminated by the various preservatives it's been stored in, including formaldehyde and alcohol, that accurate DNA sequencing is no longer possible. Various analyses over the years have identified the tissue as possibly horse, deer, lamb, bear, and even human, though none of these identifications have been confirmed with certainty. What makes the Kentucky meat shower so persistently unsettling isn't the gore of it, although that's certainly enough to turn your stomach. It's the completeness of the mystery. We know something fell. We know it was organic tissue. We know it covered a specific area in a specific pattern on a specific day. And yet, a century and a half later, we cannot say with absolute certainty what it was or where it came from. The vulture theory is the most plausible explanation we have, but even that rests on assumptions. No one actually saw vultures overhead that morning. No one reported a flock in the area. The theory is built on logic and probability, not direct observation. And in science, those are very different things. Interestingly, 9 days after the Kentucky meat shower, on March 12, 1876, red substances described as corpuscles with a vegetable-like appearance fell over London, Kentucky, roughly 70 miles to the south. Whether this was connected to the Bath County event or was an entirely separate phenomenon has never been determined. The writer Charles Fort, who made a career out of cataloging anomalous events, noted this follow-up incident and used it to suggest that the phenomenon was larger and more persistent than a single flock of sick birds could explain. Fort was a provocateur, not a scientist, but his observation about the second event has never been adequately addressed. Bath County has since embraced its strange legacy. In 2025, the community held its first meat shower festival, attracting nearly 500 visitors who came to see exhibits, participate in a mystery meat chili cook-off, and view the preserved sample jar brought in from Transylvania University. Plans are underway for an even larger celebration for the 150th anniversary in 2026, when organizers intend to reenact the shower. The event that once baffled the nation has become a point of local pride, a piece of Americana so bizarre that it loops back around to being charming. But beneath the festival banners and the chili pots, the fundamental question remains unanswered. Something rained from a cloudless sky in 1876, and we still do not know, with certainty, what it was. Speaking of things falling from a clear sky, if you travel roughly 7,000 miles east of Bath County, Kentucky, and climb over 16,000 feet into the Himalayan mountains of northern India, you'll find something far more chilling than meat on the ground. You'll find bones, hundreds and hundreds of them. Roopkund Lake sits at an altitude of just over 5,000 meters in the Chamoli district of Uttarakhand, India, cradled between the towering peaks of Trishul and Nanda Gunti. It's small, barely 40 meters across at its widest, and no more than 3 meters deep. For most of the year, it's frozen solid, a still and silent disk of ice surrounded by barren rock and thin air. But during the brief Himalayan summer, when the temperatures rise just enough to thaw the surface, the ice retreats and reveals what lies beneath. Skulls, femurs, vertebrae, rib cages, hundreds of human skeletons scattered across the lake bed and along its rocky shores. Some are submerged in the crystalline water. Others lie exposed on the gravel, half buried in sediment. A few still have hair attached to the scalp. Others have scraps of dried flesh preserved by the extreme cold. The locals call it Skeleton Lake, and the first time you see photographs of it, the name makes perfect and terrible sense. The skeletons were rediscovered in 1942 by a forest ranger named Hari Kishan Madwal, who was patrolling the Nanda Devi area when he stumbled upon the remains. At the time, the Second World War was raging, and British authorities initially feared the bones belonged to Japanese soldiers who had secretly infiltrated India and perished in the mountains. A military investigation quickly dispelled that theory. The skeletons were far too old to be from the war. For decades afterward, theories multiplied. Some suggested the dead were soldiers from General Zorawar Singh's ill-fated Tibetan campaign in 1841. Others proposed they were victims of a medieval epidemic, their bodies carried to this remote location to prevent the spread of disease. There were also suggestions of ritual suicide, that the lake had once been a sacred site where pilgrims chose to end their lives. None of these theories held up well under scrutiny. The first major forensic investigation of the site came in the early 2000s, led by a team commissioned by the National Geographic Channel. What they found was deeply strange. The skulls of the dead, regardless of size or location around the lake, all shared the same type of injury. Short, deep fractures, consistent not with weapons or battle wounds, but with blunt, round objects. The damage was found exclusively on the tops of skulls and shoulders, as if the fatal blows had come from directly above. There were no injuries to other parts of the body. Researchers ruled out landslides, avalanches, and combat. The pattern was too uniform, too specific, and too consistent for any of those explanations. Physical anthropologist Subhash Walimbe, who examined the skulls at the site, noted that the fractures were caused by something rounded, roughly the size of a cricket ball, and the only way so many people could sustain such similar injuries at the same time from the same direction was if something had fallen on them from the sky. The conclusion, as extraordinary as it sounds, was hailstones, massive ones. The researchers estimated the hail to have been roughly the diameter of a baseball, possibly larger, and it would have been falling at tremendous velocity at that altitude, where thin air offers little resistance. With no shelter anywhere near the lake, which sits in an exposed, bowl-like depression surrounded by bare rock, the travelers would have had nowhere to hide. They were trapped in the open, pelted from above by ice that struck with enough force to crack open skulls and shatter bone. This theory gained unexpected support from local folklore. Among Himalayan women, there exists an ancient song that tells of a goddess named Nanda Devi, so enraged at outsiders who defiled her mountain that she rained death upon them by hurling hailstones described as being hard as iron. The legend holds that a king of Kanauj named Yastaval, along with his pregnant queen, their attendants, and a troupe of dancers, went on a pilgrimage to the Nanda Devi shrine. Their journey was lavish and noisy, filled with song and celebration, and this extravagance angered the goddess. She sent a storm of apocalyptic proportions that killed every single person in the group. Artifacts found at the site seemed to corroborate this story. Glass bangles indicated the presence of women, leather sandals, bamboo walking sticks, spearheads, and even parasols of the type used during the Nanda Devi Rajjat pilgrimage were found among the bones. The evidence was lining up beautifully with the legend. But then, in 2019, a massive genetic study threw the entire narrative into chaos. A team of researchers from 16 institutions across India, Germany, and the United States analyzed the DNA of 38 skeletons from the lake. The results were staggering. The dead did not belong to a single group. Instead, they fell into 3 genetically distinct populations. 23 individuals had typical South Asian ancestry and dated to roughly 800 CE. 1 individual had Southeast Asian ancestry, and 14 individuals, shockingly, had genetic ancestry tied to the Eastern Mediterranean, specifically to modern-day Greece and Crete, and they dated to approximately 1800 CE, a full 1,000 years later than the South Asian group. The people at Skeleton Lake had not all died in one event. They had died in multiple catastrophic events, centuries apart, involving populations from entirely different parts of the world. Isotope analysis revealed further differences between the groups. The South Asian individuals had eaten diets heavy in millet, a common grain in northern India. The Mediterranean individuals had consumed wheat, barley, and rice, crops more typical of Greece and the surrounding region. The groups were not related to one another, did not share a homeland, and were not part of the same journey. They came from different centuries, different continents, and different cultures, and yet they all ended up dead at the same frozen lake, over 16,000 feet above sea level, in one of the most remote and inaccessible places on Earth. How did Mediterranean people, likely from Crete, end up in the Indian Himalayas in the 17th or 18th century? What were they doing on a dangerous pilgrimage route? Were they explorers, diplomats, missionaries, merchants who had wandered catastrophically off course? There is no record of them in local history, no tales of Greek pilgrims braving Himalayan ridges. No documents, letters, or journals have ever been found to explain their presence. And whatever killed them whether it was hailstones as the skull fractures suggest, or something else entirely, did so with enough sudden violence that none of them escaped. Adding to the strangeness is the ongoing loss of evidence. The district magistrate of Chamoli has reported that tourists, trekkers, and curious researchers have been carrying skeletons away from the site on mules. Government agencies have made efforts to protect the area, but the damage continues. Each year, the glacial freeze-thaw cycle scatters bones further, erases context, and makes future study more difficult. If definitive answers about Roopkund are ever to be found, they may need to be found soon. And perhaps the most haunting detail of all is this. Even with the advanced genetic technology of the 21st century, even with radiocarbon dating and isotopic dietary analysis, and the combined efforts of 28 scientists across 16 institutions and 3 countries, we still cannot say with certainty what killed these people. The hailstorm theory fits the skull fractures. The local legend aligns with the artifacts. But we cannot rule out other possibilities. We cannot prove it was hail. We can only say that the fractures are consistent with round objects striking from above, and that a storm capable of producing such devastation, while rare, is not unknown in the Himalayas. In 1888, a hailstorm in the same region killed more than 230 people and thousands of livestock. In 2013, 9 people were killed by hail in India. The ice can kill. The question is whether it killed here, at this lake, on these particular days, centuries apart, to groups of people who had no connection to one another. Now, from something that fell from the sky in the mountains of India, let's turn to something else entirely. Something that drifts through the air during storms, passes through solid walls, and kills with an explosion and the smell of sulfur. Something that, depending on who you ask, might not even technically exist. Ball lightning is one of the most elusive and controversial phenomena in the natural world, described by witnesses across centuries and continents as a glowing, hovering sphere of light, usually appearing during or just after a thunderstorm. It has been reported by soldiers, sailors, priests, farmers, scientists, and even royalty. The descriptions are remarkably consistent. A luminous orb, typically ranging from the size of a golf ball to the size of a beach ball, drifts slowly through the air, sometimes hovering just above the ground, sometimes passing through closed windows or solid walls. It hisses or crackles. It glows in colors ranging from red and orange to blue and white. It moves erratically, pausing, changing direction, or floating through a room before either silently vanishing or detonating with a violent explosion. And when it explodes, it often leaves behind the acrid smell of sulfur. For centuries, scientists dismissed ball lightning as folklore, hallucination, or misidentified natural phenomena. It wasn't until a 2012 incident in Qinghai, China, when a research team accidentally captured what appeared to be ball lightning on a spectrometer during a storm, that the scientific community began to take the phenomenon more seriously. Today, estimates suggest that anywhere from 1 in 30 to 1 in 150 people worldwide believe they have witnessed ball lightning. Thousands of sightings have been documented, and yet, despite all of this, there is still no widely accepted scientific explanation for what it is or how it forms. Theories range from electromagnetic radiation and plasma bubbles to silicon particles ignited by lightning strikes, but none of them fully account for all of the observed properties. What is not in doubt, however, is that ball lightning can be lethal. The earliest well-documented case of death by ball lightning occurred on October 21st, 1638, at the Church of St. Pancras in Widecombe-in-the-Moor, a small village on the moors of Devon, England. It was a Sunday afternoon, and approximately 300 worshippers were packed inside the church for the afternoon service. A severe thunderstorm was raging outside, and the congregation had gathered as much to seek shelter as to pray. Without warning, a strange darkness fell over the church, so thick that no one could see the person sitting next to them. This was followed by a tremendous clap of thunder, and then, according to multiple eyewitness accounts published in pamphlets within weeks of the event, a great ball of fire burst through one of the church windows. The fireball tore through the nave of the church. It smashed pews. It shattered windows. It filled the building with a choking, sulfurous smoke so thick that the congregation could barely breathe. The ball of fire reportedly split into two pieces, one crashing out through another window, the other disappearing somewhere inside the church. In its wake, at least 4 people were dead, and approximately 60 were injured. One man's skull was split into 3 pieces, his brains reportedly thrown upon the ground. A woman was so badly burned that she died of her injuries shortly after. The roof of the church tower was destroyed, and massive stones from the walls were hurled to the ground. Contemporary accounts describe the panic as absolute. People screamed, fell to the ground, crawled over one another in the dark and smoke. The minister, George Lyde, escaped unharmed, though his wife's clothing and the skin beneath it were burned severely. Because ball lightning was not understood in 1638, and because the event was accompanied by fire and the smell of brimstone, local legend attributed the disaster to a visit from the devil himself, who had come to collect the soul of a man named Jan Reynolds, said to have fallen asleep during the service with a pack of playing cards in his hand. More than a century later, on August 6th, 1753, a different kind of encounter with ball lightning ended in tragedy. Georg Wilhelm Rickmann, a Baltic German physicist and professor at the Imperial Academy of Sciences in St. Petersburg, Russia, was a pioneer in the study of atmospheric electricity. He had been conducting experiments inspired by Benjamin Franklin's work on lightning, using an iron rod mounted on his roof connected by wire to instruments inside his home. On that summer afternoon, Richmond was attending a meeting at the academy when he heard distant thunder. Excited at the prospect of taking measurements during a storm, he excused himself and rushed home, bringing along the academy's engraver, a man named Sokolov, to document the experiment. Rickman stood about a foot from the iron bar, watching the needle of his electrometer closely, assuring Sokolov that the storm was still far off and there was no danger. Then, without warning, the engraver saw a globe of blue and whitish fire, about 4 inches in diameter, leap from the iron bar and strike Richmond directly in the forehead. The physicist fell backward without making a sound. An explosion followed, described as sounding like a small cannon that knocked Sokolov to the floor and ripped the door off its hinges. When the smoke cleared, Richmond lay on his back. A red spot burned into his forehead. His left shoe was blown open, and a blue mark on his foot showed where the electrical discharge had exited his body. He was dead. The autopsy revealed that his heart was completely emptied of blood, with about half a pound pooled in his chest cavity. Rickman became the first person in recorded history known to have died while conducting an electrical experiment, and his death stands as one of the most well-documented fatalities attributed to what appears to have been ball lightning. Other incidents, though less thoroughly documented, paint a similarly terrifying picture. In August 2002, in Clear Creek Cemetery near Willard, Missouri, 3 people attending a funeral were killed when what witnesses described as a big ball of fire came down a tree and struck them during a sudden thunderstorm. In the waters off the coast during the Age of Sail, ships occasionally reported encounters with glowing spheres that drifted among the rigging during storms, setting fires and killing crewmen. The phenomenon was reported with enough regularity among mariners that it entered the folklore of the sea, sometimes attributed to St. Elmo's fire, but sometimes described as something distinctly different, something that moved with apparent purpose and exploded with devastating force. Even royalty was not immune to encounters. Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, the last emperor of the Russian Empire, described witnessing ball lightning as a child while attending a church service with his grandfather, Alexander II. During a powerful thunderstorm, the church was plunged into darkness. A fiery ball entered through the door, whirled around the floor, passed near the chandelier, and flew out through the opposite door. The young Nicholas was frozen with terror, but his grandfather crossed himself calmly and smiled, and the boy took courage from his composure. In 1944, in Uppsala, Sweden, a ball of lightning smashed through a closed kitchen window, leaving a perfectly circular hole about 5 centimeters in diameter. It passed through the kitchen, leaving the startled family members untouched, and exited through the other side of the house. The incident was witnessed by multiple residents and was recorded by the lightning strike tracking system at the Division for Electricity and Lightning Research at Uppsala University. It remains one of the few instances in which ball lightning was documented by scientific instruments, however, indirectly. What all of these cases share is a common thread of disbelief. Ball lightning behaves in ways that no current theory of physics can fully explain. It moves slowly in a world where lightning moves at a fraction of the speed of light. It hovers in midair when plasma should dissipate in fractions of a second. It passes through solid materials without leaving a trace, and then explodes with enough force to kill. For centuries, those who reported seeing it were dismissed as confused or imaginative. Today, the phenomenon is taken more seriously, but we are no closer to understanding it. The glowing orbs continue to appear during storms, drift through homes and churches and ships, and occasionally take lives, all while remaining beyond the reach of the laboratories and instruments that might finally explain them. From a phenomenon you can see, we now turn to one you can only hear, and one that not everyone can hear at that. Something invisible, undetectable by even the most sensitive instruments, and yet so maddening that it has been linked to severe psychological distress, and according to some accounts, suicide. In the spring of 1991, residents of Taos, a small artist community in northern New Mexico nestled against the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, began to report something strange, a low, persistent humming sound, almost like a distant diesel engine idling or a deep bass vibration had settled over the town. It wasn't loud, not in the way a jackhammer or a car alarm is loud, but it was constant. It was there when they woke up in the morning and still there when they tried to fall asleep at night. It throbbed in their ears, pulsed in their chests, and seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. They called it the hum. Not everyone could hear it. In fact, the vast majority of Taos residents reported hearing nothing unusual. But for those who could, and they came to be known as hearers, the experience was anything but trivial. The sound was described variably as a whir, a buzz, a drone, or a hum. Some compared it to the tone of an E-flat played at the lowest registers. It was worse indoors than outdoors, It was louder at night, and it did not go away. Hearers reported debilitating headaches, insomnia, nosebleeds, nausea, diarrhea, and chest pains. Some described the feeling of vibration so intense that it felt as though the walls of their homes were shaking. For those who were sensitive to it, the hum became an inescapable torment, a sound that followed them through every room of their house, into their beds, and into their dreams. In one documented case in England, where a similar phenomenon known as the Bristol hum had been reported since the late 1970s, the persistent noise was linked to at least one suicide. Across the world, in places as far apart as Scotland, Indiana, and New Zealand, people plagued by the hum have described the same desperate helplessness, the feeling of being trapped inside a sound that no one else acknowledges and no doctor can treat. The distress was significant enough in Taos that residents appealed to their congressional representatives for help. In the early 1990s, a formal investigation was launched, bringing together researchers from the University of New Mexico, Los Alamos National Laboratory, Sandia National Laboratories, and the Phillips Air Force Laboratory. It was one of the most comprehensive acoustic studies ever conducted on the phenomenon. The team deployed highly sensitive microphones and vibration detectors in the homes of hearers. They surveyed approximately 8,000 residents and identified about 161 who reported hearing the hum, roughly 2% of the population. The results were baffling. The instruments detected nothing. No unusual acoustic signals, no identifiable vibrations, no mechanical sources. The researchers published their findings in the Acoustical Society of America, and their final conclusion was perhaps the most unsatisfying sentence ever written in a scientific paper. They wrote that they were left with a mystery. Subsequent research has offered several possible explanations, none of them fully satisfying. One theory points to spontaneous autoacoustic emissions, sounds generated by the human ear itself that most people are unaware of unless they are in very quiet environments. Another suggests that high-pressure natural gas pipelines, which run beneath many of the areas where hums have been reported, could be generating infrasound, vibrations below the threshold of normal human hearing, but still perceptible to sensitive individuals. A third theory, more speculative, points to Takamo aircraft, military planes that use extremely low frequency radio waves to communicate with submerged submarines. These planes operate at night, their movements are classified, and many hum sites are located in coastal or military-adjacent areas. But none of these explanations have been confirmed, and the Taos Hum remains, officially, unexplained. What makes it so disturbing is not just the sound itself, but the psychological toll it takes. Researchers have noted that once a person becomes aware of the hum, it becomes almost impossible to stop hearing it. The brain latches onto the frequency, amplifies it through a process of heightened attention, and creates a feedback loop in which the hearer is constantly listening for the very thing that is tormenting them. Dr. David Bagley, head of audiology at Addenbrooke's Hospital in Cambridge, England, has described this process as a complex interplay of evolutionary adaptation, physiology, and psychology. Humans evolved to be alert to low-frequency sounds, which in the natural world often signify danger, approaching predators, distant thunder, seismic activity. Once the brain identifies such a sound, even if it's barely perceptible, it redirects attention to that frequency, amplifying the signal internally. The more the hearer focuses on it, the louder it seems to get. Sleep deprivation follows. Anxiety deepens. The body enters a state of sustained stress that compounds with each sleepless night. The hearers themselves describe the experience in terms that border on existential horror. You cannot run from a sound that lives inside your head. You cannot close a door against it. Earplugs make it worse because they eliminate the ambient noise that was partially masking the hum, leaving the low-frequency tone even more exposed and more prominent. Some hearers have reported that the hum disappears when they travel by air, only to return after a delay of hours or days once they land. Others have said that turning their head in a certain direction temporarily disrupts the sound, suggesting that the phenomenon may be interacting with the structures of the inner ear in ways not yet understood. The Taos Hum was not an isolated case. Similar hums have been reported in Bristol, England, since the late 1970s, in Largs, Scotland, since the late 1980s, in Kokomo, Indiana, and in Windsor, Ontario, among dozens of other locations around the world. In Kokomo, an acoustic consultant identified 2 industrial sources of low-frequency noise, a compressor and a cooling fan, and the sources were abated, but the hearers reported no relief. In Windsor, the hum was eventually traced to a steel plant on Zug Island in the Detroit River, but even after that identification, not all hearers were satisfied that the mystery had been solved. And for those already vulnerable, the hum becomes not just an annoyance, but a genuine danger. In one tragic case in England, a woman took her own life after years of suffering from the Bristol hum, unable to find relief or even acknowledgement that what she was experiencing was real. The hum occupies a uniquely cruel position among unexplained phenomena. It is a sound that shouldn't exist, produced by a source that has never been definitively found, driving real suffering in people who have no way to make it stop, and who often face skepticism or dismissal from the very people they turn to for help. The idea of something invisible and unexplained spreading from person to person and causing real physical harm is not limited to mysterious sounds. Sometimes the contagion is something even more primal, something you would never think of as dangerous. Sometimes the thing that shouldn't be deadly is laughter. On January 30th, 1962, in a small village called Kashasha on the western shore of Lake Victoria, in what was then Tanganyika, now Tanzania, something started at a mission-run boarding school for girls. 3 students began to laugh. There was no particular joke, no identifiable trigger. They simply started laughing and could not stop. Within hours, the laughter had spread to other students. Within days, it had consumed the school. 95 of the 159 enrolled students were affected. The episodes were not brief giggles. They lasted anywhere from a few hours to 16 days, with an average duration of about a week. The girls could not concentrate. They could not eat properly. They could not attend class. Teachers were bewildered. Nothing they tried could restore order. By March 18th, less than 2 months after it started, the school was forced to close. But closing the school didn't end it. It made it worse. When the students were sent home to their families scattered across the region, the laughter went with them. In April and May, the epidemic hit the village of Nshamba, about 55 miles away, where 217 people, most of them young, were affected over the course of 34 days. In June, it spread to another girls' school at Ramirez, where 48 more students fell ill. Additional schools in the village of Kanyangareka were also hit. The Kashasha school actually tried to reopen on May 21st, but was shut down again within weeks when 57 more students relapsed. The school was eventually sued by surrounding communities who blamed it for allowing the contagion to spread. The thing that made this epidemic so disorienting was the nature of the symptoms. Laughter was only one piece of it, and not even the most consistent one. The affected individuals also experienced uncontrollable crying, general restlessness, pain throughout the body, fainting episodes, respiratory problems, rashes, and flatulence. Some would cycle through different symptoms in rapid succession, laughing one moment and sobbing the next, then collapsing in a faint. Adults who were affected described it as terrifying. They had no control over their own bodies, no ability to make the episodes stop, and no understanding of what was happening to them. Importantly, there were no fatalities directly attributed to the laughter epidemic, and all affected individuals eventually recovered. The epidemic burned itself out over the course of approximately 18 months, ultimately affecting 14 schools and around 1,000 people, all within a roughly 100-mile radius of Bukoba. There is never a pathogen identified, no bacteria, no virus, no fungal infection. Blood tests on affected individuals came back normal. The original medical study of the event, published in 1963 by researchers Rankin and Phillip, classified it as mass hysteria, now more commonly referred to as mass psychogenic illness. The timing is crucial to understanding why this happened. Tanganyika had gained its independence from Britain barely a month before the outbreak, on December 9, 1961. The nation was undergoing a seismic cultural transformation. For the students at these mission-run boarding schools, the tension was particularly acute. They were caught between two worlds: the strict traditional expectations of their families and elders on one side, and the new, unfamiliar demands of a Western-style education on the other. Researchers like Christian Hempelman of Texas A&M University have argued that the laughter epidemic was fundamentally a stress response, a manifestation of collective anxiety that found expression through the body because the students had no other outlet. Mass psychogenic illness, he notes, tends to occur among populations with little power, people who are trapped in stressful situations they cannot escape, and who have no acceptable way to express their distress. The laughter was not a sign of joy. It was a cry for help, delivered in the only language the body had available. What happened in Tanganyika in 1962 was not unique in history, though it was unique in its scale and the peculiarity of its primary symptom. Mass psychogenic illness has been documented for centuries. The dancing plagues of medieval Europe, in which groups of people danced uncontrollably in the streets, sometimes for days on end until they collapsed from exhaustion or died, are now understood to be manifestations of the same underlying phenomenon. In more recent decades, similar outbreaks have occurred in factories, schools, and military units around the world, typically in environments characterized by high stress, rigid authority, and limited personal agency. But what makes the Tanganyika laughter epidemic particularly unsettling is the way it spread. Unlike a virus, which passes from person to person through biological contact, mass psychogenic illness spreads through observation. You catch it not by breathing the same air as an affected person, but by seeing them succumb. The brain, under sufficient stress, interprets the symptoms of another person as a signal that something is genuinely wrong, and the body responds in kind. It is, in a sense, the mind's immune system misfiring, interpreting social cues as threats, and launching a full physiological response to a danger that doesn't exist in the traditional sense. The original study of the event, published in 1963 by A.M. Rankin and P.J. Phillip, in the Central African Journal of Medicine noted explicitly that there were no fatalities. Everyone recovered. But the disruption was enormous. 14 schools were shut down. 1,000 people were incapacitated for periods ranging from hours to weeks. Communities were thrown into chaos, and the phenomenon burned through the region for a year and a half before it finally exhausted itself, like a fire running out of fuel. The Tanganyika Laughter Epidemic remains the largest and most thoroughly documented case of mass psychogenic illness in the modern era, and it stands as a reminder that the human mind, when pushed to its limits, is capable of producing symptoms that are every bit as real and as debilitating as any physical disease. From a phenomenon that spread across a community, we now turn to something that came from a place far more distant than any neighboring village. Something that traveled billions of years and millions of miles before it found its way to the most improbable of destinations and the most improbable of victims. On the afternoon of November 30th, 1954, in the small town of Sylacauga, Alabama, 34-year-old Ann Hodges was doing something unremarkable. She was napping. Wrapped in quilts on her living room couch, she dozed in the warmth of a quiet autumn afternoon while her mother puttered around the house. Outside, people across 3 states had noticed a bright reddish light streaking across the midday sky, trailing smoke behind it like a Roman candle. Others described a fireball, accompanied by tremendous explosions and a brown cloud that lingered in the air. Anne heard and saw none of this. She was asleep when something smashed through the ceiling of her rented home, punched a 3-foot hole in the roof, ricocheted off a large wooden Philco radio console, and struck her on the upper thigh and hand. The object was a chunk of rock, roughly the size of a grapefruit and weighing about 8.5 pounds. It was 4.5 billion years old. It was a meteorite, and Ann Hodges became the only confirmed person in recorded history to have been struck by one and survived. The impact left a massive bruise across her hip, an ugly, dark, pineapple-shaped mark that was photographed for Life magazine and became one of the most iconic images of the incident. She was shaken and confused, initially thinking the space heater had exploded, then suspecting neighborhood children had thrown a rock. When she noticed the hole in her ceiling and the strange black rock on her floor, she called for help. The police chief, the fire department, and the mayor of Sylacauga all responded. Within hours, a geologist confirmed the object was a meteorite, and within days, approximately 200 reporters were camped outside her house. What followed was not the windfall one might expect, but a protracted and deeply unpleasant legal battle. Anne and her husband Eugene were renters. Their landlady, a woman named Bertie Guy, claimed ownership of the meteorite, arguing that since it had landed on her property, it belonged to her. The law, as it turned out, was largely on Guy's side. The dispute dragged on for a year, during which the Air Force confiscated the meteorite for analysis, and by the time it was finally returned to the Hodges following a $500 settlement with Guy, the excitement had died down and no buyers could be found. The couple eventually donated it to the Alabama Museum of Natural History, reportedly for about $25. The emotional toll was far worse. Anne, who had been a shy and private person before the incident, was overwhelmed by the media attention and the stress of the legal battle. Her health deteriorated. She developed what appeared to be post-traumatic stress disorder. She and Eugene separated in 1964, and Anne spent her final years in declining health at a nursing home, where she died of kidney failure on September 10, 1972, at the age of 52. Her husband later said he wished the meteorite had never happened. But Ann Hodges' story, while remarkable, represents just one end of the spectrum. She survived. Others may not have been so fortunate. In 2020, researchers searching through the vast archives of the Ottoman Empire, recently digitized from documents written in Ottoman Turkish, discovered what may be the earliest credible record of a human death caused by a meteorite. According to 3 official letters written by local authorities and forwarded to Sultan Abdul Hamid II on August 22, 1888, a bright fireball appeared in the sky above a village near Sulaimaniya, in what is now the Kurdistan region of Iraq. The fireball trailed smoke as it passed overhead and then exploded, sending meteorites raining down on a pyramid-shaped hill for approximately 10 minutes. The falling debris killed one man and left another paralyzed. Crops and fields in the surrounding area were also destroyed. The letters are bureaucratic and matter-of-fact, the work of government officials recording an extraordinary event through the dry language of administration. One letter mentions that stone fragments were collected and sent to authorities in Constantinople, though researchers have so far been unable to locate the actual specimens in any museum or archive. Without physical evidence, the 1888 event remains classified as probable rather than confirmed. But the credibility of the sources, their consistency, and the level of detail they provide make this, in the words of the researchers, the strongest historical evidence yet of a meteorite killing a human being. The universe, it turns out, is not only indifferent to our existence. Occasionally, it takes aim. The statistics behind meteorite strikes offer cold comfort. Scientists estimate that more than 50,000 meteorites have hit the Earth, though the vast majority land in oceans, deserts, and uninhabited areas where no one is around to notice. The odds of any individual being killed by a regional meteorite impact have been calculated at roughly 1 in 1.5 million over a lifetime, which is actually higher than most people would expect, slightly more likely than being killed by a fireworks accident, and significantly more likely than winning a major lottery. The reason the odds are that high is not because individual strikes are common, they are vanishingly rare, but because when a large asteroid does strike, the consequences are catastrophic enough to affect millions of people at once. It's the averaging of rare, apocalyptic events across an entire population that produces the seemingly paradoxical statistic. More recently, the dangers of objects from space were demonstrated dramatically on February 15, 2013, when a 60-foot asteroid entered Earth's atmosphere above Chelyabinsk, Russia, traveling at approximately 40,000 miles per hour. The intense heat and pressure caused it to explode as a superbolide, a massive fireball, roughly 19 miles above the surface. The resulting shockwave blew out windows across the city, and more than 1,200 people were injured, mostly by flying glass. $33 million in property damage was recorded. Had the asteroid been slightly larger, or had it entered the atmosphere at a steeper angle, the outcome could have been far worse. The Chelyabinsk event was captured on dozens of dash cams and surveillance cameras, providing the most comprehensive visual documentation of a near-catastrophic meteorite event in history, and serving as a stark reminder that the bombardment from space is not a relic of Earth's violent past. It is ongoing, and finally, from the vastness of space, we return to a hospital room in Riverside, California, where on the evening of February 19, 1994, something happened that still defies complete explanation. Something that turned an ordinary emergency department into a hazardous environment, and a dying woman into a source of toxic fumes that brought trained medical professionals to their knees. Gloria Ramirez was 31 years old. She was a mother of two, and she was dying. 6 weeks earlier, she had been diagnosed with late-stage cervical cancer, and the disease was advancing rapidly. That evening, around 8:15 p.m., paramedics brought her into the emergency room of Riverside General Hospital. She was experiencing severe heart palpitations, dangerously low blood pressure, and difficulty breathing. She was barely conscious. The medical staff went to work immediately. They administered sedatives, drugs to stabilize her heartbeat, and supplemental oxygen. When those measures failed, they prepared to defibrillate. But as they removed Gloria's shirt, several staff members noticed something strange. Her skin was covered in what looked like an oily sheen. And there was a smell, a fruity, garlic-like odor emanating from her mouth. Then a nurse named Susan Kane drew blood from Gloria's arm, and everything changed. When Kane pulled back the syringe, she noticed an unusual ammonia-like smell coming from the blood. She also saw what appeared to be small, manila-colored crystals floating in the sample. She passed the syringe to a medical resident named Julie Gorczynski, who held it up to the light to examine the crystals more closely. Within moments, Kane fainted and collapsed near the door. Gorczynski followed shortly after, dropping to the floor with shakiness and severe shortness of breath. A respiratory therapist named Maureen Welch was next, losing control of her limbs and collapsing unconscious. The emergency room was evacuated. A skeleton crew of staff stayed behind to continue working on Gloria, but it was too late. At 8:50 p.m., roughly 40 minutes after her arrival, Gloria Ramirez was pronounced dead. Her official cause of death was cardiac dysrhythmia resulting from kidney failure, both consequences of her terminal cancer. But the real mystery wasn't what killed Gloria. It was what Gloria did to everyone around her. In total, 23 of the 37 staff members working in the emergency department that night reported experiencing at least one symptom. 5 were hospitalized. Julie Gorczynski, the medical resident who had examined the blood, spent 2 weeks in the intensive care unit with breathing problems and subsequently developed hepatitis and a vascular necrosis in her knees. She would never fully recover. The initial investigation was conducted by the California Department of Health and Human Services. They interviewed 34 staff members using standardized questionnaires and identified clear risk factors. Those who had worked within 2 feet of Ramirez and handled her intravenous lines were at highest risk. But the findings also contained puzzling inconsistencies. The affected individuals were disproportionately women, and all had normal blood tests after the exposure. Based on these findings and the absence of any identifiable toxin, the state released a report concluding that the incident was most likely a case of mass sociogenic illness, in other words, mass hysteria. The affected workers, the report suggested, had essentially made themselves sick through collective panic. This conclusion was met with outrage, particularly from the affected staff members, who insisted their symptoms were real and physical, not psychological. And they had a point. Julie Gorczynski's 2-week stay in intensive care was not a product of anxiety. You don't develop a vascular necrosis in your knees from a panic attack. The case was then referred to the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, one of the most advanced forensic research facilities in the country. Analysts there ran Gloria Ramirez's preserved blood and tissue samples through a mass spectrometer and made a significant discovery. Her blood contained abnormally high levels of dimethylsulfone. This chemical is a natural metabolite of dimethyl sulfoxide, commonly known as DMSO, a solvent that had gained a following in the 1960s and 70s as a home remedy for muscle pain before the FDA restricted its use after studies showed it could cause eye damage. It continued to be available as an industrial degreaser and maintained an underground reputation as a pain treatment. The Livermore scientists developed a theory. If Gloria had been applying DMSO topically to manage her cancer pain, this would explain the oily sheen on her skin and the garlic-like odor from her mouth, both known side effects of DMSO use. In her body, the DMSO would have been metabolized into dimethyl sulfone. When paramedics administered supplemental oxygen, the oxygen-rich environment could have further oxidized the dimethyl sulfone into dimethyl sulfate, a compound so toxic that it has been classified as a potential chemical warfare agent. Exposure to dimethyl sulfate vapors can cause convulsions, delirium, paralysis, respiratory failure, and death. 19 of the 20 symptoms reported by the hospital staff that night were consistent with dimethyl sulfate poisoning. The theory was elegant, and the Riverside coroner's office endorsed it. It has since appeared in forensic science textbooks, but it has never been proven. Several organic chemists challenged the Livermore findings, arguing that the proposed chemical conversion from dimethyl sulfone to dimethyl sulfate had never been observed under the conditions described. Others pointed out that dimethyl sulfate poisoning typically has a delayed onset of several hours, not the near instantaneous reaction the hospital staff experienced. And critically, dimethyl sulfate itself was never actually detected in any sample from Gloria Ramirez or the emergency room. Gloria Ramirez was buried on April 20th, 1994, 10 weeks after her death, at Olivewood Memorial Park in Riverside. Her family maintained that the hospital was responsible for her death and that the entire incident was a cover-up, possibly related to a previous toxic gas leak at the same facility. Alternative theories have ranged from a contaminated intravenous bag to a secret methamphetamine lab operating within the hospital. None have been substantiated. What remains is a dead woman, 23 sickened healthcare workers, one permanently injured doctor, and a chemical hypothesis that fits the evidence approximately but not precisely. Gloria Ramirez, the toxic woman of Riverside, took whatever truly happened in that emergency room with her to the grave, and the scientific community, for all its instruments and expertise, has never been able to say with certainty what turned one dying woman's body into a weapon. What makes the Ramirez case so enduringly fascinating and so deeply troubling is the way it sits on the border between explanation and mystery. The Livermore theory is plausible. The chemistry, while disputed, is not impossible. The symptoms match, approximately. But approximately is not the same as proven, and in the years since 1994, no one has been able to replicate the proposed chemical conversion in a laboratory setting. No one has demonstrated that dimethyl sulfone can transform into dimethyl sulfate inside a human body under the conditions described. The theory remains, in the language of science, a hypothesis, not a conclusion. Some alternative explanations are darker. Investigative journalists from the New Times LA proposed that the hospital had been the site of illegal methamphetamine manufacturing and that a contaminated intravenous bag had been inadvertently connected to Ramirez. The hospital denied this categorically, but the accusation added another layer of suspicion to a case already drowning in unanswered questions. Gloria's family, who had watched her die while the people meant to save her, collapsed around her, maintained until the end that the hospital bore responsibility, not just for her death, but for the entire chaotic scene that unfolded that night. The autopsy itself was performed under full hazardous materials protocols. with technicians wearing protective gear as though they were entering a contaminated site, because, in a very real sense, they were. They found no toxic, volatile, or hazardous vapors in the samples. They found a woman killed by her cancer, her body ravaged by disease, and a mystery locked inside her blood that no amount of analysis has fully decoded. Julie Gorczynski, the medical resident who was most severely affected, suffered lasting damage to her health. She filed a lawsuit against Riverside County, eventually reaching a settlement. She has spoken publicly about the incident, insisting that what happened to her and her colleagues was physical, not psychological, and that the mass hysteria explanation was an insult to people who nearly died. These are the stories that sit at the edges of what we understand, events that resist tidy explanations and linger in the mind long after you've heard them. From meat falling out of a clear sky to skeletons killed by impossible hailstones, from glowing orbs of fire that drift through churches to an invisible sound that drives people mad, from laughter that spread like a plague to rocks from outer space that found their way to a sleeping woman's hip, and finally to a body that somehow poisoned an entire hospital wing. Each of these events reminds us that the world contains forces and phenomena that science has not yet fully mapped. Thank you for watching. If you found this video interesting, I'd really appreciate it if you'd hit the like button and consider subscribing to the channel. It helps more than you know, and it means we can keep telling these stories.